Hello and welcome to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I am your host, Adam Conover. Here's what the podcast is for my first-time listeners. I do a TV show on True TV. It's an educational comedy show called Adam Ruins Everything. And on that show, I talk to fascinating guests, experts in fields from across the realm of human knowledge. But on the show, I only get to talk to them for a couple minutes. On the podcast, I bring them into the studio and we talk to them at length about all the fascinating topics and ideas that they have to offer us. We bring their awesome but academic and maybe sometimes kind of dry and difficult to access work to you in a light, fun podcast setting. At least that's what we attempt to do. And at the very least, I get to satisfy my curiosity about all of the incredible work that they do. And by the way, in case you were wondering, and I know a lot of people are, Adam Ruins Everything is coming back to True TV starting August 23rd. We got 14 big episodes coming at you all through the rest of the year. And you can also find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. But what are we doing today? Today's guest is Professor Donald Shoup, who appeared on the Cars episode of the show. Donald is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Urban Planning at UCLA, but more importantly, he is well known as America's foremost parking guru. Now, you might be saying to yourself, parking guru, that sounds like a boring thing to be. But in fact, and take my word for it, it is fascinating. Donald's work revolutionized the field of parking research. Again, a real field that he, in fact, revolutionized. This guy is renowned in the world of urban planning, urban development. The people who are designing our cities to look the way that they're going to look revere this guy's work. And when you think about it, parking drives everyone crazy, right? Like, apart from owning the car, having to buy the car and fuel the car and being stuck in traffic, parking is definitely the worst part of the whole car thing, right? At least it's up there. I would say it's tied for first place with the other 5 things that are terrible about driving cars. But parking is, in general, such a frustrating thing. There's never a parking space. You got to pay for it. You're subject to a fine. And what Donald's research shows is the way that we handle parking in this country is totally wrong. Almost every city is screwing it up big time for fascinating reasons. So we're going to hear all about him in this episode. Let's get to the interview. Thank you so much for being here, Donald.
Well, thanks for inviting me and for giving me free parking.
Yeah, well, it is provided by the building. It's a bit of a ironically, a bit of a parking nightmare outside this building today because there's a street fair going on. And so there's guys waving sticks and $10 parking signs and stuff like that. This is one of those areas that coming to anyway, I'm always a little bit stressed out about finding a place to park. The very common experience for people in LA. Let me ask you this to start out. Did you end up researching park? Like, you live in LA. Did you end up researching parking because you live here and you were so frustrated by it? Or did you start researching parking and then saying, well, I got to go to where the parking is at. I got to go to Los Angeles?
Well, I don't think it was either one of those. I lived here in LA when I think at my first publication about parking must have been 1976.
Wow.
And but it wasn't because I was in LA, although the example I used was definitely LA. LA is a great place to study parking.
I can imagine. I feel like I study it every day, frankly, living here.
Well, I think in an ideal world, you wouldn't even think about parking. Just
right.
As you don't think about most of the things that you worry about, the things that you're going to buy or that you have to do. I think the best parking is the parking when people aren't talking about it.
Right. But it's something that gives people such stress generally, not just finding it, but people almost sort of have anxiety about parking spaces being taken away, or there's too much, like when there's new development, people say, oh, it's gonna ruin my, my parking situation or whatever. And ends up being this big anxiety. And honestly, the reason we initially contacted you when we did our Cars episode was, to us, it seemed like this big unexamined downside of car culture that, not only do we have to buy these things and learn how to pilot them around without killing each other, that's enough stress, and pay for insurance and everything, we also have to figure out where to keep these enormous, everyone has a 2-ton, 10-foot-long metal object that they have to store somewhere, and they have to figure out where to store it every time they take a trip. It's sort of a bizarre burden to put on people.
Well, I think almost everybody thinks about parking as a personal issue and not as a policy issue or not an urban planning issue. And I think because you think only as a consumer, as a driver, that when you enter any kind of political arena, you say we need more parking. I mean, everybody wants to park free, including me. But that doesn't mean that free parking should be a basic policy of urban planning or public finance or transportation planning, because free parking conflicts with almost all the other goals of urban planning or transportation or even public finance.
So explain to us why, because your famous book is called The High Cost of Free Parking, which is a perfect sort of Adam ruins everything counterintuitive topic. Free parking, this thing that everybody thinks should be good. I don't know if you know the TV show South Park. It's even a line in the theme song, ample parking day or night. It's like, what could be better than free parking? Thank God if you find some, right? But there's a huge downside to it. Free parking isn't actually something that we want. And I know I'm asking you to summarize many decades of work in a few sentences, but why is that?
Well, I think because we want parking to be free, and it's a political goal in many places. Council members can't say to someone like you, when there's a building being built next door that doesn't have enough parking, that, well, suck it up, that they have to listen to their constituents. And one of the biggest motivations in parking planning is council members who never want somebody to telephone and say, how did you let this happen?
Ah, yes.
So their goal in parking policy is to make sure that nobody ever complains to them that there's not enough parking. And that's why we have very high parking requirements, so that any new building like this one has to come with often as much parking as there is space for everything else in the building. In fact, that most people, at least who live in the cubicle world, their car has much more space than they do. So there's more space for cars than there is for humans in most new buildings. So I think that because politically it's so popular to have free parking, it's hard for any politician to think seriously, well, maybe we should do things a little bit differently. Do it the way they do it in New York or San Francisco, at least in downtown, where instead of requiring parking, they limit it. Say for a concert hall downtown, like Disney Hall in L.A., that's quite iconic. It has, I think, 2,200 parking spaces.
Wow, 2,200 underneath the concert hall.
6 levels of underground parking.
Wow.
You take an escalator cascade up from your parking garage straight into the lobby, so you never set foot on the sidewalk. But for the same concert hall in San Francisco, Louise Davies Hall, they have no parking attached to the concert hall. When the concert is over, when you leave the auditorium, the sidewalks are bustling with people. All the bars are open.
Those people are going to restaurants.
That's right.
They're going out for drinks. They're stopping and buying a piece of art from the guy on the sidewalk who's doing paintings or whatever.
That's right. And if you drove, you have a walk to get to your car. If you drove, in L.A., the LA's requirement for a concert hall. L.A. requires 50 times more parking as a minimum than San Francisco allows as the maximum.
Wow. So
the two cities are not different just because it happened, but because it was planned that way. In L.A., we built the parking structure for Disney Hall 7 years before we started Disney Hall on top of it.
Really?
Because we needed extra money to finish Disney Hall. And the funding gap that they were trying to close was smaller than what they had spent on the garage.
Wow.
So I think parking is the number one concern in L.A., and it would be hard for most politicians to say, well, we'll build Disney Hall without any parking, even though there's plenty of parking all around it.
Yes.
Downtown L.A. has more parking spaces per square mile than any other city on earth.
Wow.
And yet people think there's not enough. I mean, when you think of L.A., there's a lot of surface parking and a lot of very tall parking structures, and every new building like Disney Hall has more space devoted to underground parking than to the interior of Disney Hall. So it's, I think, what downtown would most people like to go to? Downtown LA or
Yes.
downtown San Francisco?
Well, that's what. When people talk about which cities they enjoy sort of being in, it's always the ones that are very walkable. That it's maybe hard to get into, but then once you're there, you can stroll from block to block, and parking. I mean, I think I forget what the number is now, but I think part of what we were getting at in our cars episode was the sheer amount of space that's devoted to parking ends up blighting downtowns because it's this sort of economic desert, right? It's like it becomes this huge area in which there's nothing fun to do, there's no money to be spent, there's no art or commerce to engage in. There's simply we're storing a lot of cars while they're asleep. And it creates that effect when I moved to LA from New York, I had the sense of always feeling very tiny because when I go anywhere, my joke is like, you're like, you get out of your car and you're like, I think I see the In-N-Out burger like a mile away. Like you're there, but you're still so far away from where you're going. And God help you if you want to go to the next business down the street. You can walk a quarter mile before you get to the next one.
Well, that's right. In some of our parking lots, I think you can see the curvature of the earth.
It's like, oh, is that Christopher Columbus's ship surrounding the the edge of the Home Depot, or is it? You also make a point about not just minimum parking requirements for developments, but literal free parking spaces on the street. Am I right about that?
Well, that's right. And they're highly linked. That if the parking is free on the street, it would be very damaging to your idea of the neighborhood if they built a new restaurant without any off-street parking, because all the patrons would park in front of your house or in front of your business or something like that. So if the curb parking is free, cities almost have to require off-street parking, or else there just wouldn't. All the curb parking would be filled up, and people would say there's no parking, by which they mean all the spaces are full.
So the free parking on the street incentivizes requiring all of this off-street parking, but then that parking is blighting the neighborhood because it's all this unused space.
That's a great way to say it. I think that who wants to walk by a parking lot or the facade of a parking structure? All the things you come to downtown for are damaged by having to pass a lot of surface parking lots.
Right.
And there are cars driving across the sidewalk, getting to and from the parking.
Right.
I think one of the most walkable cities in California, or even the world, is Carmel, California.
I've never been. Sounds lovely.
People come from all over the world to walk around Carmel, and they prohibit any off-street parking.
Really?
They don't want any cars driving across the sidewalk. They want all the interiors of blocks to be for art galleries and restaurants and things like that. And the parking is on the periphery of the downtown, but they don't allow any off-street parking downtown because they think that detracts from the reason you go to a walkable neighborhood. Whereas some cities, San Francisco does it. They prohibit surface parking lots for more than 2 years. If you tear down a building, you can't use it as a surface parking lot for more than 2 years. If you don't build something, it has to be empty. So I think when you think of the whole city, there are a lot better ways to plan and manage them than we do in L.A., in most cities of the U.S., and now more countries around the world are following us. They say, well, the Americans know how to deal with cars. They've had them longer than we've had them.
They're adopting our bad habits.
Definitely, they're copying them.
Oh. There's also a phenomenon where, and correct me if I've got it wrong, this is my chewing it up and spitting it out back out at you, dumb version of your work, so forgive me. But where a problem with free parking spaces, and I've done this myself in LA, is that if you know that there's unmetered parking or there's cheap parking, or say you're driving downtown and you see the place that's, $10 and you can park right there, you say, well, I'm just going to go drive around the block because maybe I'll go up that residential street, maybe there's an unmetered spot I can go grab. And the existence of those spaces causes traffic, correct? Because you have lots of people driving around and around?
That's right. People have been studying this for a long time. The first study that was done was appropriately in Detroit in 1927, and they looked at cars circling blocks in downtown Detroit in 2 locations. I think in one area they estimated that 18% of the cars were hunting for parking, and in another area something like 25%.
25% of the traffic was just people looking for a place to park.
That's right. They've already arrived.
Yes.
They finished their trip.
They're where they're trying to go, but they're still on the street.
That's right. And the curb parking was more than 100% filled because people park in red zones and things like that. But that kind of study has been done in various ways. In one city in Germany, the German Automobile Association set up TV cameras or video cameras taking movies of the cars in traffic, and they could follow it by looking at the license plates because they were one at every intersection. And they found that 68% of the cars were hunting around because they could go back and after a car had parked, they could say, well, where had that car been before? And how much of the traffic was cruising for parking. And I think there have been another various ways to do it. In New York, one study interviewed drivers who were stopped at traffic lights and said, are you hunting for curb parking?
Yeah.
And in one Brooklyn neighborhood, it was 45% of the drivers said yes.
Wow.
And in a street in Manhattan, it's something like 28%.
Wow. I mean, that's at least one way to, because again, people are so precious about their parking. If you were to say to people, hey, we got to get rid of this free parking, and they say, what? No, I need it. But if you say, well, it'll stop the traffic, that's like maybe the only thing worse than looking for a parking space is being stuck in traffic. So hopefully that's at least a rhetorical way to get people on your side with the issue.
I don't think it helps. No.
Well,
what I do have, what I would say what would help, and that is, and this is beginning to happen around the world, is that if you tell a neighborhood that if we put in parking meters and charge the right price, by which I mean the lowest price you could charge, and still have 1 or 2 open spaces on every block, so that when everybody drives around, it'll be great parking karma, that when you get where you're going, you'll see an open space waiting for you.
Right.
Well, so if you charge that price, it'll vary by time of day because demand varies by time of day.
So this is like a dynamic price where there's a computer looking at how many spaces are open, and they're saying we're going to find just the right price so that enough people will be disincentivized from parking there that there's always going to be a couple spaces open.
That's right. They don't change the price from minute to minute, but they set different prices at different times of day and on different blocks, and they adjust them once a month or something to nudge the price up on crowded blocks and nudge them down on half-empty blocks. But with that money, you tell the neighborhood, we'll spend all the revenue to pay for added public services on your street. It won't disappear to the general fund. We'll fix all your sidewalks. Say Pasadena is one of the first cities to do this. In Old Town Pasadena, well, you're too young to know, but it used to be a commercial skid row, and now it's one of the most popular tourist destinations. And,
yes.
Not just tourists, but places for people in the rest of Los Angeles to go to.
Yes.
But it was people thought it was derelict, it would never recover, but it had wonderful buildings in terrible condition. It was a great commercial center in the 1920s, and then with almost no off-street parking. And then in the 30s, of course, there was the Depression, then World War II. And then after that, everybody had cars, and it didn't work as a commercial area anymore with no parking. So people went to malls, and it kept decaying. The buildings were still great, but most of them were empty above the ground floor. And nobody knew what to do until finally it was proposed. It came from the city saying, if we put in parking meters. Oh, yes, they had proposed parking meters, and the merchant said, there were few remaining merchants said, no, it'll chase away the customers we have.
It had been free before, and they said
it was free with a 2-hour limit. But when they did studies, they found almost all the spaces were occupied by either the store owners or their employees who moved their car every 2 hours and complained about they didn't have any parking for their customers.
Right.
So the city wanted to put in parking meters, and the merchant said, no way, it'll chase away the few customers we have, until finally the city said, all right, if we put in the parking meters, we'll spend all the money on fixing the sidewalks and the alleys and the public infrastructure in Old Pasadena. And like that, they said, well, that's different. Why
Yes.
didn't you tell us that? Let's run the meters till midnight. Let's run them on Sunday. Let's charge a high price. The only thing that changed was if we put in the parking meters, you will get all the revenue to fix your terrible sidewalks,
Yes.
like we have in much of L.A., and to clean up your filthy alleys, and to put in historic streetlights and street furniture. And they got instant buy-in from all the merchants and property owners. So what they did, I think it was very smart. You could borrow money against parking meter revenue. So they started out by borrowing $5 million to rebuild all the sidewalks and to clean up the alleys.
Saying that this amount of revenue is going to come in from the parking meter, so that's why we get the loan, is we'll pay it back over.
That's right. And you'll see benefits right away. As soon as the meters go in.
Because they take that loan and boom, they fix the
That's
sidewalks.
right.
Wow.
And so they did everything a city could do to make the area look good. They put in, rebuilt all the sidewalks. They put in new street trees with beautiful cast iron tree grades. They put in historic light fixtures.
And now that area is revitalized.
That's right. And as soon as that happened, all the property owners realized this was going to be a premier place, and they began restoring their buildings, which is very expensive, restoring a historic building. It didn't pay before because the rents wouldn't recover the cost of the restoration. And so the combination of the public sector doing what only the public sector can do and the private sector following along with what it could do led to an immediate increase in sales tax revenue.
Wow.
You can't say that parking meters are going to hurt the area if you spend the meter money in the area, because the parking meters, they earned about $1.5 million a year. And I think the debt service on the bonds was only about $400,000 a year. So they had about $1 million a year to spend on. They steam clean the sidewalks every 2 weeks. They sweep them every night. They remove graffiti every night.
This is blowing my mind, because we really don't. Parking is not something that people ever think about, but by this sort of small change in parking policy, you can transform this entire block.
That's not just block; it's about a 15-block area.
Wow, and giving it to the local block makes so much sense, because something that people say all the time in L.A., and I'm sure other places they say this as well, is, oh, the parking enforcement, they just do that to make money for the city. Those parking tickets are just going to pad some coffers somewhere, we don't know where.
Which is true.
Yes. That's true. So the conspiracy theory is correct. It's like, well, they don't need to sweep the streets that often. It's just a revenue source for the city, yada, yada. But if that money was going to, if I knew that when I got a ticket for street sweeping or when I put money in the meter that it was going to my block, I would not feel so cynical about it.
Well, I think it's different from that. I think the people who are putting the money in the meters are not the people who work there.
That's true.
See, it's for visitors from outside of Pasadena, and when they get there and they get out of their car into a beautifully clean area with very handsome street furniture, and they put their money in the meter, they don't know where the money goes.
Yes. I see.
But they're not important politically. If somebody who lives in Glendale is of no political importance in Pasadena, but somebody who owns a store there or lives there or owns property there, they're the ones who count in the political game, and they're the ones who can see this is not tax money. This is money mainly paid by visitors.
Yes.
Visitors who think they're getting a good deal. And when you put your money into a parking meter in Pasadena, I think it said your meter money goes to clean sidewalks, clean streets, safety and security, something like that. They do something similar in San Diego, and the meters say turning small change into big changes.
Ah, that's nice.
See, it is a small amount of money. You can't claim it's a big deal if you have to spend $1 an hour on a parking meter. But when it all adds up from everybody is paying that, it can make a big difference. And excuse me, getting back to your question, that's what creates the desire to charge the right price for parking. Not the fact that it would reduce cruising or air pollution or climate change.
Right.
See, all these things are important, but it doesn't have much clout in the Pasadena City Council or any other city council. You have to tell people this is what we're going to do with the money. You will be better off. And who has any influence on parking policy in a particular neighborhood? It's the people who live there and work there and own property there.
Right. Well, we are here talking to Professor Donald Shoup. We'll be back in just a moment, so stick around.
Why would you listen to a podcast of TV pilots that never got made? It must not have been any good, right?
I don't know for a fact that anyone read it.
They couldn't get the deal done. There was kind of a regime change.
Someone at the studio who was in a decision-making capacity said, "These guys seem like losers."
They just blamed it on, okay, well, it must be women.
We got word that USA had decided to stop doing comedy.
Why aren't we making this? It was so good.
Hear the TV comedies you never got to see on the Dead Pilot Society podcast. Listen on MaximumFun.org or wherever you download podcasts.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm here talking to Professor Donald Shoup, who appeared on the Cars episode of Adam Ruins Everything. Just sort of a more general question. I feel like a big part of American car culture is that our use of the roads and the parking spaces should be free. People sort of have this idea that they need it and it's owed to them. I'm thinking about when I lived in New York and Bloomberg was putting in bike lanes here and there, and people, you're taking away our parking spaces. Oh, we need the parking spaces. That was the voice they had New York accents. We need them. But there's also I think I encountered when I was encountering your work the idea that people need to pay for the space that they're using. That's sort of odd to have an expectation that one could store one's car someplace for free. Is that a component of it, or?
Well, it's not an odd expectation. We've been doing it for 100 years.
Yes.
Since before we were all born. And it's hard to say to do it differently. And that's why it's taken me a long time. I think I was working on the book for maybe 30 years.
Wow.
And 800 pages long. but as you rightly pointed out, you can summarize it very quickly. And I think that we have gone through the points that I'd like to make. There are three things. I think if they work together,
please,
it'll be revolutionary. One is to charge the right price for curb parking so that there are always one or two open spaces there. Second, spend all the meter money on the blocks where it's collected so the residents will see the benefits of the meters. And they're not thinking about climate change. They're thinking about the fact that my sidewalk is safe and clean.
Right. But it also helps reduce like emissions and traffic and all those other things.
That, of course, from a bigger policy point, that's a much more important thing. But for a local political influence, so get the right price for curb parking, spend the meter money on the meter streets to make it popular. And third, then you can remove the off-street parking requirements. Because nobody can say we have to have tons of off-street parking if wherever you go, you see one or two spaces open.
Mm-hmm.
See, so then it doesn't mean that the developers wouldn't put in parking.
Mm-hmm.
It just means the city wouldn't be telling them how much to put in or
I
require
see.
In order to get permission to build an apartment building with 10 apartments. We no longer say you have to include 20 parking spaces.
Got it.
You decide how many parking spaces to put in. Maybe 10 is enough if the people pay for it. Say that the parking would no longer be free, but it would be available and it would be paying for a lot of things that we all want. And if
it would be priced appropriately.
I think so. And the biggest... there'd be great benefits from all of them, but if we get rid of the minimum parking requirements, then a lot of the empty lots downtown that are now parking lots could be developed for something else.
Right.
Now, on a lot of surface parking lots in downtown and in other cities, it's hard to put a building and all the required parking on a small site at the same time.
Yes.
And that means it just stays a parking lot. So,
Yes.
but if you said you could have a building with no parking or a building with 5 parking spaces or something like that, then they say, I see what you mean. And I think we have the biggest proof of this happened in downtown L.A. It's nice to talk about some good things that LA is doing.
I think they're making some progress. We had Salita Reynolds on. She talked about a lot of wonderful things they're doing in transportation in LA generally. So they're moving the needle. But what's this?
I doubt if she mentioned parking.
Yeah, she didn't mention parking. No, that's not quite.
Downtown LA is said to have the largest collection of intact office buildings from the early 20th century in the country.
Interesting.
There's some great old office buildings
Yes.
on Spring Street and Broadway. Spring Street used to be called Wall Street of the West. There were a lot of finance buildings there. The Los Angeles Stock Exchange was there. But then the city said we had urban renewal money from the federal government as we bulldozed everything on Bunker Hill and built new buildings and sucked the life out of that area because all the new Class A office buildings with air conditioning and plenty of parking were on Bunker Hill. So these very large buildings, often 10, 15 stories high, emptied out above the ground floor. Most of them were empty above the ground floor. The ground floor was very active with commerce, especially the Latino community.
Yes.
And nobody could convert the buildings into housing because they didn't have the required parking. See, L.A. requires 2 spaces per condominium unit for any condo building.
And assuming any condo is going to have 2 drivers owning their own cars at a minimum.
That's right.
That's crazy.
And if everybody does have 2 parking spaces, there probably will be 2 cars.
Yes,
and 2 drivers. But it was a very smart urban planner, Alan Bell, came up with the idea we should allow the conversion of distressed historic office buildings into housing without any new parking. There were other features of the policy. It's called the adaptive reuse ordinance. You could adapt an old building to a new use and only housing. And the critics said, this will be a disaster, that no lender would lend for the conversion of an office building into housing without new parking. Nobody would buy a condominium without 2 parking spaces. No bank would lend for that. It'll be a disaster. The only disaster that could happen is that nothing would happen.
Right.
But the critics were proved wrong. And in the 8 years after this ordinance was adopted, I think it was in 1999, 57 historic office buildings were converted from empty wrecks to wonderful new condominiums with something like 7,000 apartments. And just think of the number of people that employed, all the plumbers, the electricians, and the architects, and the drywallers, and the urban planners, and the housing it provided, and it has led to a rebirth of that area. A lot of people live down there now.
Well, that's the story of, when I moved to LA. It's like, downtown is booming. It's coming back, and it's because of this change.
It wouldn't have happened, I think, without this simple change that you can convert an empty office building, a historic office building, into housing without any new parking. And I think that it worked well enough. They've extended it to other parts of town. This part of town, it's allowed as well. And there have been some amazing conversions here. And a lot of people, they don't know that there was any history to this. They just think, well, isn't this nice? And so it converted another Skid Row into a very wonderful place, and it saved a lot of historic buildings. They survived because they were too big to tear down and too expensive to tear down, but they would have fallen down. But it saved a lot of historic buildings, and they were beautifully preserved. The Eastern Columbia building is a famous example with its blue terracotta surfaces, and it also saved an entire historic district.
Yeah.
See, if it all happened and suddenly they were all being converted into housing, then there were restaurants for the people there, and you can't say it was reducing the amount of affordable housing because they were empty office buildings.
Yes. Now, all those people who are suddenly in that space, I mean, if they haven't added any parking, is there now a parking calamity in that neighborhood, or are those
Not
people
at
taking
all.
public transportation, or what are they doing?
Most of them have cars, but
Yes.
they have to pay for parking. As I said, there's more parking per square mile in downtown LA than any other city on earth.
Right, so it's already there. You just have to pay for it.
You just have to pay to park your car. And I think that's the way it ought to go. That I ought to pay for my parking, and you ought to pay for your parking.
Yes.
Because if I park free, somebody else has to pay for it.
Right.
And that's somebody
Someone's paying for it somewhere down the line.
and that somebody is everybody, including people who are too poor to own a car.
That's true. It's true. Their taxes are paying for our car ownership.
Well, and even when they're paying for their car ownership or their parking, it can be a problem. I recently did some research that finally you see what gets to people. Something gets a lot of attention. And one very simple thing, I estimated the cost of building a parking space in 12 cities in the U.S. for which I had data. That's just an average cost. So for a parking structure like the one in this building, where I just parked free, it's about $24,000 a space.
$24,000 a space.
That's right. And for an underground structure like a Disney Hall, the average is $34,000. At Disney Hall, it was $52,000. But on average, because that's very gold plated with the
Right.
cascade of escalators and things like that.
Yes.
But so $24,000 and $34,000. Well, how are we really able to pay for this? So I looked at the data on the median net wealth of the United States. So your net wealth would be all your assets minus all your liabilities.
Mm-hmm.
So for the Latino population, the median net wealth is $7,000. And for a black population, it's about $6,000.
Okay.
So we are requiring parking spaces that these people have to use that cost far more than their net wealth.
Yes.
And that a lot of people have negative net wealth.
Right.
That they owe more than they have assets.
Yeah.
So especially young students who have a lot of college debt. They have human capital, but not something they can cash in on. So we're requiring them also to help pay for all this parking.
And that also puts me in mind of what you said about how we have the line from the show is we have we have expensive housing for people and free or cheap parking for cars. And
That's right.
Our priorities are backwards in that.
That's
way.
right, but the free parking has to come from someplace.
Yes.
And I think that just because you're a low-income minority who's parking free in a building, it doesn't mean you're not paying for it.
Yes, it's still coming out of your pocket somehow.
If you're an employee, say, of a firm in this building that gives you free parking rather than cash income, that it would be better, I think, if the person rode a bike and I got a higher salary. And that's, I guess there's a fourth policy that I recommend, but it's not like the first three. The first three are charge the right price for curb parking. Second is spend the revenue in the parking benefits district. Third is remove minimum parking requirements. But the fourth was the thing that initially interested me, is that the most common fringe benefit in the United States is free employee parking.
Yes.
Something like 95% of everybody who drives to work parks free when they get there.
Yeah, you don't even think of it as a fringe. You're just like, well, I need to have a place to park. How would I get to work?
That's right. It's my employer's. Do I have to pay to go to work? So the proposal I made for that, and it did get enacted into state law, is that if anybody, say in this building, has employees and they have to rent parking spaces from the building owner. It isn't as though the employer gets the parking free. They have to pay the landlord for parking. And say in Century City, that I know a lot about, it's all about $250 a month. But if you come to work for me, I'll give you free parking. And it's a tax-exempt fringe benefit. So the federal government says it's a lot better for me if I get my $250 as a free parking than if I get $250 in cash because I have to pay Social Security taxes, I have to pay income taxes.
Exactly.
The employer has to pay payroll taxes. So the new law is that if your employer rents parking and offers it to you free, the employer has to offer you the cash alternative if you prefer cash.
Ooh, I like that.
So if I want to take, rather than a free parking space, I'd rather have $250 a month. I could take that. I'd have to pay taxes on it,
Yes.
income taxes.
But then you can take a bike to work.
I could bike, I could walk, I could carpool, I could take the bus. And so we interviewed employers in California that had complied with it, and we had data from their commuter surveys that they're required to file for the Air Quality Management District. And it was fascinating talking to the employers about it. People were skeptical. They said it would be a big burden on employers.
Yeah. Well, to process the
that's
paperwork
right,
and
all
everything,
the paperwork. So I asked them about that. They said, why no? It's as difficult as changing somebody's number of dependents on a W-2 form.
And this is the law in California today.
That's right.
Is that the case?
If the employer offers free parking that they rent from the landlord, which
Yes.
is just about everything downtown, and you have more than 50 employees,
Yeah.
you have to have more than 50 employees. I don't see why.
I literally could have been doing this when I worked at College Humor. I didn't know it. I had a free parking spot, and I was driving in, and I'm pretty sure they were renting it from the parent company. So I could have been getting an extra $250 a month, and it would almost pay for Ubers for a month. $250.
This was before Uber when it was started out.
Fair enough.
But the state has never publicized the law or enforced it. It's odd. A lot of employers comply if their employees bring it to them.
So you have to literally go to your boss and say, "I found a weird loophole on a podcast. You owe me $250 a month."
I think you may get a great bonus from listening to this podcast.
If anybody does this, please tweet at me or email me and let me know if you go to your employer and say, "Take the parking space away and give me $250 a month."
And the employers who did it always said that they thought it was a very good policy, that they said they always use it into their recruitment, say.
Right.
Especially one law firm in Century City, it had an environmental section. Apparently every big law firm has environmental experts because it's such a big area of litigation in California. But they said a lot of employees said that they really like this offer because it showed that the law firm is trying to be part of the solution. They're trying to do something good. They
Right.
thought it made them feel better working for the firm if they thought it had that policy. Even if they drove to work, they thought it was a very good policy. And the employer said that they thought it's fair. They thought it's a good incentive. One employer said, cash works very well for us. And I'm thinking, well, cash works very well for anybody. But if you're trying to reduce your carbon footprint for a firm,
Right.
then one way to do it is say, oh, by the way, I'm spending $250 a month for your parking. Would you rather have the cash and bike or skateboard? We found 2 employees who started skateboarding. And now you have electric skateboards.
Well, a law firm wouldn't want their lawyers to be skateboarding. It's so cool. That's how you get the millennial crowd.
Well, I think that now we have a lot of opportunities ahead of us that we've been doing things so wrong-headed for so long.
Yes.
That's no reason to keep doing it. But I think it shows that by some rather small policy changes, we can make big changes in the results.
And let me ask you this, because I remember reading that the minimum parking requirements that you talk about, which I think that's your Moby Dick white whale, right, is to kill the minimum parking requirements, that those in many cities, at least in LA, are not based on any research, any science. It's just a force of habit where the city is like, for this kind of building, for the condo, you need 2. For the Walt Disney Concert Hall, you need 2,200. They've just got some formula that's based on nothing.
Well, it's based on what's always been there.
Yes.
It's been there since before you were born. I mean, how are you to come along and say to your superiors that this is a bad idea? Or if the planning commission say, well, we've had a dispute here in Koreatown about all these new nail salons. What should be the parking requirement for a nail salon? You can't tell them, I don't know.
You just give, I don't know, 10. It's always good as 10 for nail salon.
You can't tell them that I think they're a bad idea. You should get rid of all minimum parking requirements. That would be very foolhardy. So put yourself in the shoes of a young planner who works for the city and wants to keep their job. They have to say, well, we surveyed the parking requirements for nail salons in Southern California, and this is what we found. You know, it's 8 spaces per 1,000 square feet, and that's what the new one becomes.
This is a question I often have about urban planning sort of wonks such as yourself who have done the research, right, devoted your life and found this is the optimal way to do things. And then there's the question of actually getting a city to take the step. So you've been playing this fiddle for a long time, very, very vocally. I mean, your work is renowned in the field. I think people, it's certainly not suffering from lack of notice, right? Do you see the needle moving on this topic, or is it starting to become part of common practice in urban planning, or is it, are there still barriers in the way, or?
Well, I think it's a lot has changed. It's because of people like you and a podcast like this that
publicizing it. Yeah. That's the little contribution I can make, I suppose.
Well, I think it takes journalists to get these ideas across, and they know how to interest an audience and keep people reading. And I've been lucky that journalists like you have picked up on this.
I'm so flattered to be called a journalist. I am but a humble comedian who reads a couple articles a couple times a year, but I hope to be able to promulgate the ideas myself.
Well, when I've looked at your Adam Ruins Everything, they are the most serious, funny things I've ever seen. You look like the planning wonk to me.
It's true. I often wonder how I'm still able to call myself a comedian making a show like this, because it's true. It is extremely serious comedy. And that's why, by the way, the comedy we do on the show is so dumb. Our jokes are the stupidest jokes you can make in comedy because the content is so dry. You sort of have to put them next to each other.
That's what it takes to
Yes.
get the things across. It takes somebody who could have it's beyond the podcast. It's the videos that you do that are so wildly imaginative.
Thank you.
And I think, yes, I get invited around to a lot of cities in a lot of countries, and I'm kind of an evangelist. I go to these places.
Yes.
And I think, especially among young people, it clicks.
Yes.
They sort of feel the key turning in the lock. I see what we need to do.
Yes.
And young people don't have that much influence, but they'll grow older and
Yes.
they'll get into positions of authority. And who was it? The famous physicist said that science marches on funeral by funeral.
I love that.
It isn't that older planners are necessarily changing their mind,
Yes.
but they'll be replaced by people who have, well, here's this senior person in the field who has been just completely running down or dissing a major field and a major tenet in our profession, and nobody has disagreed with them. Nobody, I say that minimum parking requirements, they hurt poor people, they damage the economy, they hurt the environment, they ruin urban design, they make good architecture impossible, they pollute the water and the air, and so many things like this. And not a single urban planner has said, no, minimum parking requirements don't do this.
Yeah.
There is simply silence on the other side. Silence and nothing happening.
Yes.
But
But then those people die.
Well, that's right. But even some of them are changing.
Yes.
A lot of cities have removed parking requirements downtown, and Buffalo is on the verge of removing all parking requirements of the city. Instead of a long code of pages and pages and pages of 10 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet for a fast food restaurant with a drive-in window. Then the page of this, it's just a 2-sentence replacement. No off-street parking will be required for any use. It's so much easier to say it.
Yes.
So I I don't know how long it'll be before even smaller cities like Fayetteville, Arkansas, just turned around and said there'll be no off-street parking requirements for any commercial use.
So you see hopefully a sea change coming. In a way that, I mean, it seems to be happening in other urban design topics, such as public transportation and bike lanes and things like that. As cities all across the country are making progress on them, and hopefully in this area as well.
I think so, and I think the newest arrow in my quiver was the saying we can't afford them. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you say one parking space costs more than 3 times the net wealth of a minority in this country, then you think, well, how can planners trumpet their concern for equality and for the low-income people?
Yes.
And, I mean, we think we're a rich country, and we are in many ways, but there are these national rankings of median net wealth, not just for minorities, but the entire population. I think for the U.S., the median net wealth for all families is something like, it's only $60,000 or $70,000.
Yeah.
But we're number 23 in the world in this ranking. That Australia is something number 1 at $500,000.
Wow.
And Switzerland, all the usual. Iceland is way above us. This is the median net wealth per family. Half above and half below. Mm-hmm. We're nowhere near the top. We're down near where Greece is, because it's not the same thing for average wealth. The mean wealth. We're number 5 in the world. We're behind Sweden and Switzerland.
But that would be distorted by a number of very, very wealthy people at the top. But the median meaning the person in the middle.
That because we have so much inequality.
Yes.
That the people at the bottom, compared to other countries like almost any European country, the median net wealth, this is not income, it's net wealth, is lower than 23 other countries. And I think we just can't afford to keep these parking requirements. They cost too much.
I love, here's what I love about talking to you is that you've studied parking. I love that you see all topics through a parking-related lens.
That's exactly it.
That you're zoomed so far out to, like, wealth inequality in America. We can help solve it by eliminating minimum parking requirements.
I think it's that big. I think that the benefits will be so great that it gives you a sense of optimism for the country. We're not like Bangladesh, where they would have to work 24 hours a day for years to get anywhere near the median for the world. All we have to do is stop doing bad things. If we stop doing bad things, we have more opportunities than all these other countries, because there's all this land that could be built on.
Yes.
Housing adjacent to offices. I think we could do so much if we weren't dragged down by these parking requirements, and if we took advantage of all the possible income from on-street parking.
Yes.
And we got rid of all this anxiety about the fact that I can't find a place to park.
I think your phrase "stop doing bad things" would be an adequate subtitle for Adam Ruins Everything. We need to stop doing bad things.
Oh.
Let me ask you, this is my last question, is I noticed that your URL for your personal webpage is Shoup Dogg. And that's also how you signed the copy of your book you gave me today, was you signed it as Shoup Dogg. How did you come across that nickname?
Well, Snoop Dogg comes from Long Beach, as I did too. We were born in the same city.
That's incredible. Is that the only thing you have in common with Snoop Dogg, or are there other things as well?
Well, he invented the word. He called it Snoop Dogma, and I call my work Shoup Dogma.
That's so wonderful. Well, I think it's incredible how entertaining and fascinating you make this topic, and how, again, as I sort of said in the intro before you came in, it sounds like when you first hear, like, how could parking possibly be interesting? How could it possibly matter that much? And after talking to you for 50 minutes, it's suddenly, I'm seeing like this is a major issue in my mind now. It's incredible.
And it can be funny.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Don. It was really wonderful talking to you.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you once again to Donald Shoup for coming on the show. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And that is it for this episode of Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in. Our producer is Sharon Morris. If you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend and subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a rating or comment whenever you subscribe. And again, Adam Ruins Everything, the TV show, is coming back with all new episodes on August 23rd. And you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything and the Watch True TV app. And once again, if you are interested in seeing me tour, please go to adamconover.net and check out all those tour dates. Thanks again. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture. Artist owned.
Listener supported.